All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Colin Keizers, and today we have invited Charles Clark and Adam Daniel-Hampson from SecurityScorecard to give us a presentation for the webinar, the final countdown to NIS2, best practices for managing supply chain security. You can just, if you have any questions during the webinar, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll try to answer them during the webinar. So just use it if you want. And then without further ado, I will give the word to Charles Clark and he will continue the presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Colin. Morning, everybody. So I'm Charles Clark. I oversee the Benelux region here at SecurityScorecard. I'm joined by my colleague, Adam Daniel-Hampson, Global Solutions Architect lead. We'll talk you through a little. First, we'll overview some of NIS2 directive. Adam will then dive a little further into more of the solution-based topics. So, as you know, in today's world, the supply chain security is more crucial than ever. Businesses rely very heavily on digital technology, on network of suppliers, and whilst it's beneficial, it exposes organizations to big risks, particularly in cyber attacks. So, recognizing this, the European Union has introduced the NIS2 directive, which aims to establish the high level of cybersecurity across all member states. So to understand first, the NIS2 directive is a significant piece of legislation. It's designed to enhance cybersecurity across the EU. It replaces the NIS directive. It expands the scope and it strengthens the requirements to address the ever-evolving cyber landscape. And one of the core objectives of NIS2 is to bolster cybersecurity posture of a wider range of entities operating in the EU, and this includes public and private entities that play a vital role in functioning of the economy and society. So it is really pushing open the expanse of the catch from European Union and the companies within. So the scope of NIS2, expanded sector coverage. NIS2 includes new sectors like telecoms, social media platforms, public administration. There is the inclusion of medium and large entities. So it mandates compliance for medium-sized and large entities active in those covered sectors. And it removes the distinction between essential service operators and digital service providers that existed under the previous directive. There is a bigger focus on ICT supply chain. So for the first time, NIS2 directly addresses cybersecurity of the supply chain and recognizes its criticality in overall cybersecurity. Then we look at the key requirements. The cybersecurity risk management. NIS2 mandates that entities implement appropriate and proportionate technical, operational, organizational measures to manage the risks. So the measures are to be risk-based and should at a minimum correspond the requirements of Article 21 of the directive or provide for greater detail. We have incident reporting. Entities are required to report significant incidents to their designated CSIRT or competent authority. They must also inform potentially affected recipients of the services about the significant cyber threats and advise on potential mitigation measures. Adam will come on to some of that later. Supervision and enforcement. The NIS2 strengthens supervisory and enforcement measures to ensure compliance. So it is a stricter set of measures. Competent authorities are empowered to conduct on-site inspections, audits, security scans, and request information to assess an entity's cybersecurity risk management practice. And supply chain under NIS2. So NIS2 underscores the importance of supply chain security, and it recognizes that vulnerabilities in one part of the supply chain can compromise the entire system. Key provisions addressing supply chain insecurity include, as you can see, coordinated risk assessments. So the NIS cooperation group, the Commission and NIS2 will conduct coordinated risk assessments for critical ICT services, systems and products in each sector. And these assessments consider both technical and non-technical factors, including the potential for interference from non-EU countries. mandatory certification. Member states can require essential and important entities to obtain a specific certification for ICT products, services, and processes under the EU Cybersecurity Act. This provision aims to ensure that entities comply with their obligations relating to supply chain security. We'll talk a little about best practices. We'll start on the left, understanding your supply chain. So understanding your supply chain, identify critical suppliers. So pinpointing the suppliers and the service providers that are crucial to your operations, particularly those involved in providing ICT products and services. To assess the cybersecurity posture of your suppliers, including their policies and technical capabilities. And this assessment should cover aspects like network security, endpoint security, application security, and data leakage. Consider all of the risk factors. So go beyond technical risks, consider non-technical factors such as geopolitical influence, political interference from non-EU countries, because these factors can significantly impact supply chain. Bear all these in mind as Adam takes on to talk about the technical measure in a little while. So implementing the robust cybersecurity measures, establish a comprehensive framework. So implementing a strong risk management framework, aligning with the directive. The framework should encompass all aspects of cybersecurity, from risk assessment and mitigation through to incident response and recovery. To adopt a holistic approach, put in place appropriate technical, operational, and organizational measures to manage cybersecurity risks effectively. Address key areas such as incident handling, vulnerability handling, disclosure, supply chain security, encryption, and data protection. Bottom left, foster collaboration and communication. So promote NIS2 awareness, raise awareness within your organizations about the requirements and the importance of supply chain security. This awareness building should involve all levels of the organization, and particular emphasis on C-suite and senior management. Define roles and responsibilities in the business, make sure that there are responsibilities for managing supply chain security, and ensure that everyone understands their role in maintaining secure supply chain. Communicate security expectations, so communicate your cybersecurity requirements and expectations to your suppliers. Make it clear that security is a top priority in your business and your relationship with your suppliers. Encourage information sharing, so create channels for seamless and secure information sharing and collaboration with suppliers regarding cyber threats, vulnerabilities, and incidents. In the bottom right, we talk about continuous monitoring. That is one of our sweet spots, continuous monitoring and improvements. Regular monitoring and assessment. Establish a system for regular monitoring and assessment of your supply chain, including security ratings, periodic reviews, and staying updated on any changes in the security posture of your supply chain. Conduct security audits. So carry out periodic security audits and assessments of your suppliers, and make sure that they're maintaining adequate security standards. And those audits can be conducted by internal teams or external experts. Track and manage any vulnerabilities. Implement a robust process for tracking and managing vulnerabilities that emerge within your supply chain. This process should include promptly addressing vulnerabilities through patches, updates, and other mitigation measures. And then finally, leveraging technology and automation. So the utilization of cybersecurity tools and technologies such as ours, utilize cybersecurity tools to automate those security tasks and get a greater visibility into your supply chain. And this can involve security information and event management systems, threat intelligence platforms, vulnerability scanners, and security ratings platforms such as ours. So having given some of the background of what is kind of required under the directive, the best thing to do now is to hand it over to Adam, who can lead you into the solutions from our side.
Thank you, Charles. If you could just bring that screen back up again, just so I can talk to that one, just the slide that you had open. Lovely, thank you very much. So Thank you for the introduction, Charles. I am going to be facing or pivoting between two screens, so please don't take that as I'm ignoring anybody on the call. I'm genuinely not, but I will pivot back to look over and make sure that you're all paying attention. So I wanted to just take a few minutes here just to talk about how we get from our current state to a more NIS2 directive compliant state. And it won't be a surprise to many of us that TPRM certainly hasn't been the focus of our security. Certainly hasn't been for a lot of companies, where directives historically, as Charles was saying, were directed specifically at ensuring your own security and that your own level of incident and reporting is of a sufficient level. And so over the years and many years, our processes for assessing our supply chain have been somewhat limited. And when I say somewhat limited, I'm sure all of us have been the recipient or the sender of security questionnaires. Now, this is something that the NIS2 directive, but others as well within other parts of the European Union, like DORA, and even to a certain extent when GDPR and ISO as a more kind of global directive that was introduced, tried to introduce more modernized, I would say is probably the best, more modernized processes for assessing our supply chain, and unfortunately have somewhat failed. But now that it's more of a universal focus, where no matter what governing body you fall under, or no matter what environment you fall under, most of the directives or frameworks out there today will have a conscious bias towards an improvement or a continuous monitoring of our supply chain. So for those of us that are in the bottom left of this process, which is the manual TPRM process, it can seem somewhat daunting that we are currently today sending a questionnaire as our assessment process, and we may reassess at contract renewal time, and we may only really get notification through our own threat intelligence platforms of significant incidences, but being able to marry up a significant incident with certain suppliers and certain vendors that we work with can seem somewhat of a daunting process. So the idea with solutions like SecurityScorecard is to help our customers and help those in the space that are being mandated by directives such as NIS2 to move ourselves up the scale, right? To move ourselves towards that manual or away from that manual TPRM process to more of an automated assessment within those vendors. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a very short and brief look into how we can help you basically potentially go from the bottom left, if that's where you are today, or even if you're in the middle part, but slightly further towards the right hand side of this graph, which is automated understanding of risks, preemptive assessment, so the ability to preemptively ascertain whether or not there are particular problems within our supply chain, look at the things like concentration risk, and then look at downstream events within our suppliers as well, including a very robust mechanism to help share and make a difference, i.e. change those outcomes with those suppliers that we are working with, and by extension with the suppliers that they are working with. This is certainly a cumulative effect where we can impact not only our direct suppliers, but if they are taking the same directive that they are being mandated to do, direct their suppliers as well, and we'll be able to provide some visibility there as well. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully I can just take over from what Charles is showing here. And
do you want to stop sharing?
No, it's okay. I think I've got it. As long as you can just tell me you can see my screen. Okay, fantastic. So what I'm going to do is show you a little bit about some of the basic processes and steps that we can take today to just move ourselves very quickly up that maturity scale if we need to. So the first thing one of the things that SecurityScorecard does is it allows you to monitor all of your suppliers within your supply chain. Now that is a very bold statement, because people say all suppliers, including the very, very small ones that have an extremely small footprint, or maybe use managed services, or they have a go-to-market strategy of using cloud services only. Yes, all companies. So SecurityScorecard, what we aim to do in the beginning is to provide unlimited continuous monitoring and visibility of our complete supply chain. So it comes with a very old adage, or an old saying, if you will, that you can only view or only understand what your risk is if you have visibility into that risk in the first place. So the first thing that we do at SecurityScorecard is we allow you to add every single company that you're working with. How do we do that? What does that look like? Well, the way in which we can do that today is most importantly using a company list or company name list. So if you've got a list within your procurement tools today of the 100, 200, 300, 400, 10,000, 40,000, 100,000, the number goes on of vendors that you work with, simply adding that in a list, it could just be the company name if you wanted to, in a CSV format would allow us to then upload that directly to your tools. Now, for some of those that have maybe slightly more integrated or automated services, you can also integrate that with your procurement tools, your SAPs, those sorts of things, where you can feed directly into something like SecurityScorecard to get that full visibility of your vendors. That is the initial step. We start with the foundational awareness of just pure visibility. What are all the vendors that I'm working with? Forget all of the other impacts, forget all of the other assessments and everything else. And then what we do from there is we start to do more of the directive-driven approaches, which are classification. So I've now uploaded, I've got 207,000 vendors here that I'm working with. What do I do now? And the first step is really about classifying the impact of those organizations. Now, this is something that can be done through the engagement with the vendor or internal stakeholders. It's actually something that we can help with as well, but I won't labor that point as much. But let's say you have your classification, you have your impact already defined within those key vendors. And for those that even aren't classified or defined, it's still good to be aware that there are events or incidences that happen. What we do is we put them into what we call portfolios. So we just group them, right? Critical vendor, tier 1, high risk, whatever the vernacular or whatever the naming convention is that you'd like to use for the classification of your vendors, it's the ability to group those vendors based upon common impact. It could be cloud providers, ICT, managed service providers, whatever that might be. Now, the important part here is that once we do that classification, that grouping, and I've managed to narrow from those 207,000 down 1,600 of those that are critical. And again, I'm using larger numbers here to really just highlight the fact that scalability is our friend, right? We shouldn't be afraid of the number of vendors that we work with or limiting ourselves to just those 10 critical vendors, because realistically, the risk comes from everywhere. Even though we try to negate and say tier 2 and tier 3 we shouldn't really worry about, even those vendors themselves, whilst they might not hold personally identifiable information or other sensitive criteria of information, might still have an impact on the business, right? They might still have some kind of impact there. If we look at some of the providers that or incidents that have happened in the past where air conditioning vendors or those that have had what would have been deemed as non-critical impact on the business have had significant impact through, unfortunately, concepts that we can't even perceive at the time until after the event of an incident has occurred. So we can put them into our critical classifications, but the important thing is we still can get visibility of everything. Now, one of the important parts of the NIS2 directive especially is, can I specifically report or have awareness of incidents or breaches within my supply chain? And can I do that quickly? And can I do that continuously? And the answer is yes. So of these 1,610 vendors that we're looking at, we can look for, as Charles was saying earlier, critical vulnerabilities, incidences or breaches, classifications. We can look for specific services or exposures that are in use within those suppliers. We can see how often that happens. So this is the more reactive approach, but we can also be proactive. We can set up alerting and integrations into your existing tools, Jira, ServiceNow, whatever that might look like, already pre-built, already confirmed, and already supported, so that you can get alerting into your existing alerting tools when an incident or a breach occurs. So that's getting towards the right-hand side of that maturity model that we spoke about. So being able to see from those 1,600 or so vendors which ones have had a breach or an incident, we can take that down to 53. So now we're starting to really hone in on those areas that we might want to follow up upon. We might want to look up in a little bit more detail. And you can see that it affects all sorts of organizations, not just the biggest companies in the world, but also some of the smaller ones, right? So you can see that some of them are government or Office of Personnel Management. We can see those that are affected are also some of the smaller companies in in the world, or at least the ones that we're monitoring as well, but also some of the bigger companies on top of that as well. So if we go into any of these, for example, and we look at one of those organizations that may well have been affected, we get a clear and defined breakdown of exactly what it was that caused the breach or the incident or the event. Now, the second part to this, or the third part really, if we're getting into it, is not just about the visibility and awareness that, okay, some of our vendors have been affected. We're being asked to start to talk about how can we take effect on this, right? How can we affect a change? How can we create visibility? How can we be a little bit more proactive? Now, something that SecurityScorecard has done since its very early inception has been the ability for organizations to engage with the vendors that we work with. Now, this basically means that if we find something critical within our vendor or find something that we need them to take action upon, we can actually integrate and work with that vendor directly. Now, this is something since the tenure of SecurityScorecard that has been important. And again, drawing it back to the NIS2 directive, is that sharing and communication and awareness of visibility of data. Now, whilst historically, other organizations that do something similar may have charged or basically stated to the third party that you're working with, you must pay a monetary amount to the provider in order to get visibility. What SecurityScorecard has done has always been that anyone in the world can claim their scorecard for the ability to share threat intelligence and information about their security posture. And that in particular is really important, because what it's meant is that today over 100,000 vendors trust and use SecurityScorecard in their supply chain or as part of a recipient of a supply chain analysis. So, for example, I could be sending something to my supplier and my supplier could be sending something back on to another supplier downstream of theirs. And the idea is that as a recipient of something like SecurityScorecard, which continuously monitors the supplier and continuously monitors critical vulnerabilities and exposures, it means that we can start to be proactive rather than reactive. So that's definitely moving to the right-hand side of that maturity model. Being able to say, well, I'm not just reacting on an event or an incident, I'm also being able to say, look, there are some key things that my threat intelligence team is telling me, and within my suppliers, a certain percentage of those are effective, and we would like you to take a proactive approach to resolving and preempting, and unfortunately, something like an event or an incident. So being able to share or communicate within those suppliers, and we've created that ecosystem through, as I said, over 100,000 organizations globally using SecurityScorecard in some capacity to help proactively monitor those risks, is again helping us to get ahead of that that unfortunate kind of enforcement of policy for NIS2 when it comes to things like not being able to identify incidents or breach within the supply chain. So again, what we're able to do, engagement with those vendors, engagement with the companies that we're working with. But when you look at it from 207,000 vendors that we've looked at, and we've then broken it down into, that's a vast number of vendors, of course. We've then broken that down into those things that we really care about. We've actually managed to break that down to 53. So you can imagine if you're looking at 10,000 and the scales of, or economies of scale, that would actually be in the 1 or 2, which is a very manageable process to be able to assess and look for those organizations that have had incidences. Now, what we can also do, and one of the other parts there in terms of downstream investigations within our suppliers, is we're able to, within that space as well, we're able to look at the extended supply chain of our ecosystem. So let's say, for example, we are being asked, and again, it's one of the directives here, but I think is also one of the hardest parts of the NIS2 directive, because it's easier to state this is something we can do, and it's a lot less hard to implement, is being aware of your downstream implications, right? So things like concentration risk. What percentage of your entire ecosystem is concentrated upon a certain aspect? And without bringing up too much in terms of the historical, when we think about things like Microsoft and CrowdStrike, and the effect that the combination of the two, one of the most popular operating systems in the world and one of the most popular endpoint detection and response systems in the world, combined to create almost a perfect storm. The question that we often get, not only from our own internal team, but also as these directives become more enforced or more heavily enforced, is, what is the impact of our business? What is the downstream, or what is the supply chain downstream impact of our business? So with things like SecurityScorecard's ability to look at concentration risk, we can see the number of connections that our direct suppliers have with other suppliers out there. And unsurprisingly, we can see, of course, the Googles, the Microsofts, of course, there's a huge concentration risk there in terms of technologies. But we can also see, as we go down the list, that within there might be some, smaller organizations, right, that we work with in the event of a critical exposure to, say, Zoom.us, for example, or the Zoom the service of technology. In this case, it could be anything, right? So it doesn't have to just be technology. It could be any organization. It could be, a news media. It could be anything. We can see that the exposure there for us is around about 7% of our suppliers may also be impacted. And again, we can take steps to then communicate and talk about those as well. Now, the very last thing that I wanted to talk about before we kind of jump into a little bit more is again, specifically within the NIS2 directive, being able to call out things like service providers, or what our cloud exposure looks like in terms of high-risk products, breaches, and incidents. Being able to come down and see specifically with a regional level of detail what our suppliers are using in terms of their cloud infrastructure, especially if it comes to points that Charles made around geopolitical, around the ability to identify those organizations that may work or operate within regions that have a direct conflict within the European Union. A lot of the information here allows us to identify and, of course, filter and look at those impacts as well. So if we're looking at a specific region, or we're looking at a specific area that we need to focus in on, we can see of those suppliers that we're working with, what percentage have some sort of coverage or exposure within their own cloud environments across their suppliers, and be able to see what percentage of those have an impact on the kind of cloud exposure as well. And again, it goes back to things like vulnerabilities and critical vulnerabilities, being able to be proactive. So as an example, I can come in and say, those organizations that I work with that have a specific, in this case, vulnerability that is related to an exploitable or an exploitable vulnerability that we know can be exploited by threat actors out there as well. So the vulnerability and continuous monitoring and the proactive elements are really important there too. And then last but not least, within the tool itself as well, is the ability to create or build proactive alerting and rules. So again, what we can do is we can set certain triggers based upon certain activities, certain events. For example, I want to know about any of those breaches within the organization, which we're continuously collecting from their ecosystem, from our ecosystem, from the world. And I want to be notified on any of those within my portfolio, and I want to take then action, right? So I can then start to be proactive. I can send an alert. I can integrate this with Microsoft Teams, for example, or I can integrate it with, as I said earlier, Jira or Splunk or other tools that I might have that will kick off an initiation to our existing processes. Right, so if you already have today, when a threat intelligence feed tells you about an incident, you've already got a program or a process that alerts you upon event or incidents. We can integrate or work with that existing process to add our information specifically around the supplier and the supply chain capabilities as well. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about, and we're bang on around about half an hour. I'm very conscious that our attention spans are somewhat limited, and I do want to make sure that we have time for questions if there are any. But I just want to summarize a little bit about what we've spoken about here, and certainly what Charles has mentioned. The NIS2 directive is certainly a massive upgrade from the NIS directive that was in 2016. And as with a lot of these new directives or frameworks that are coming out, some of the the terminology can be quite open, right, and open for interpretation. Now, of course, we've taken our view on that and tried to incorporate some of the common requirements that we see, not just within the NIS2 directive, but within DORA and GDPR and ISO and everything else that are also informing the same requirements. And based upon our experience, we're able to see that the commonality or the common requests across all of those, if we're looking to not make too much of an assumption on the interpretation of these directives, is very simple. Continuously or on an ongoing basis, monitor your supply chain, specifically to alert for incident or breach. Being able to proactively identify clear risks or clear exposures within our supply chain so that we can take a positive communicative action with those suppliers. Really, really key, and being able to sit there, and that's again agnostic of directive here. And then lastly, being able to report specifically on those direct and indirect, so downstream suppliers that may have an impact on our go-to-market or our go-to on our go-to-market or any kind of approach as well. So reporting, continuous monitoring, and compliance across all of those are really important. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time. We really appreciate you joining and hearing our perspective on the NIS2 directive. But if there are any questions or anything you'd like to know a little bit more about, please let us know.